Gemara that we've been learning, Mishnah, talking about being Masachech, using boards for schach. And the issue that we're concerned about is the Gezeiras Tikra, it's called. The Gezeira, that it's very similar to a roof. When you use a board is very similar to a roof, the way a person roofs their house. And so we're dealing with, is there a Gezeiras Tikra? Where is the Gezeiras Tikra? Where do we have such a decree of not using a board for a schach because it resembles a roof of a house, which is for sure not valid for schach, not valid for a sukkah. So the Mishnah had an argument. It had a machlokes Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda, where Reb Yehuda was lenient. Reb Meir prohibited these nasarim. And the Gemara is going to talk about what exact case are they dealing with? How big of these board? How big of a board are we talking about that you would use for your schach that would resemble a roof? Now, the Mishnah also mentioned that if it is 4 handbreadths wide, the sukkah would be kosher, but you're not allowed to sleep under it. So it does give us a little hint to something about 4 handbreadths. It doesn't make it very clear what the case is, and is this opinion both Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda? In other words, it's the end of the Mishnah. The beginning part of the Mishnah talked about an argument, Reb Meir, Reb Yehuda. And the end of the Mishnah, didn't say any name. The end of the Mishnah just mentioned this law that if you do use a 4 handbreadth board, the sukkah will be kosher, but you can't sleep under that board. So the Gemara goes through this and mentioned we had an argument. We had the argument of how to explain the Mishnah. We have Rav's opinion, and we have Shmuel's opinion, and we need to know them well in order to move forward on the Gemara. So you need to really know what Rav holds and what Shmuel holds now. What does Rav hold? Anyone want to tell us? Want to share with us what Rav's opinion? Again, we've turned the page to 14b, but I'm just going over this argument, which it was on 14a, because we need to know it well if we want to understand the Gemara. So we're on 14a now, talking outside about the argument of Rav and Shmuel. Could anyone tell us what Rav's opinion is and what Shmuel's opinion is? What is this argument of Reb Yehuda, Reb Meir, that Rav explains one way and Shmuel is going to explain another way? Anyone want to tell us what does Rav hold? (14a). Anyone? We're like past halfway down the page. The Mishnah is somewhere around halfway. We're after that Mishnah. So 14a. Rav and Shmuel. Rav holds one thing, explains the Mishnah one way, and Shmuel is going to explain it another way. We need to know this well. If you want to understand 14b, you really got to have it clear.
Rav says that the machlokes is when they're 4.
When you have boards that are 4 handbreadths wide, that's where the Mishnah's argument is applicable. What happens if they're less than 4 handbreadths wide, these boards?
Then they're kosher.
Then for sure they're kosher according to all opinions. Okay, very good. Thank you, Mordechai. So Rav explains that if they're less than 4 handbreadths wide, they're for sure kosher. If they're more than 4 handbreadths wide, it's an argument, Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda. Reb Meir would hold that there is a Gezeiras Tikra, there is a decree that it looks similar to a house, and Reb Yehuda doesn't seem to buy into that. Similar to a house. It's kosher for schach. That's it. Yehuda doesn't buy into that, and he says it's kosher. That's the way Rav explains the argument in the Mishnah. Now, what does Shmuel hold? Anyone else besides Mordechai want to tell us how Shmuel explains the argument? In the opinion of Shmuel is expressed in the Gemara with Rav Papa explaining what Shmuel meant, because Shmuel's statement is a little vague itself. So Rav Papa comes along and explains what is Shmuel referring to. How is Shmuel explaining this debate, this argument? So we need to know what Rav Papa says. Anyone want to tell us what Rav Papa says? We're on page 14a, the bottom half of the page, close to the bottom. So where is the case of the argument, the way Rav Papa explains it? All right, Mordechai, if you want to tell us, wanted to give other people a chance.
Okay, Shmuel says that Shmuel says that if it's 4, then everybody says that it's possible. But if there's less than 3, there's a machlokas, and then it turns out that the machlokas is between 3 and 4.
So if it's less than 3, also everyone agrees it's kosher.
It's kosher.
So this is the way Rav Papa explains Shmuel. Now, what this means is that there's a situation where boards are going to be for sure kosher according to everyone. There's a situation where boards are going to be for sure invalid according to everyone. And then there's a type of board, a size of a board that's going to be a machlokes, an argument. That's the way Shmuel is going to explain. This is Rav Papa's explanation of Shmuel, and the way Shmuel's explaining the Mishnah, that it basically is an argument between 3 handbreadths wide and 4 handbreadths wide. Again, you have a board, very simple case. You have a board that's between 3 handbreadths wide and 4 handbreadths wide, and you want to use it for your sukkah. This is a machlokes, it's an argument. But if it's more than 4 handbreadths wide, for sure it's invalid. If it's less than 3 handbreadths wide, it's for sure valid. Now, it's interesting because Rav Papa is explaining Shmuel. So there is one of the commentaries, the Rif, wants to say, you know what? Even though we normally paskin, we normally follow Rav against Shmuel, but here, because Rav Papa is explaining Shmuel, it sounds like he agrees with his view, and therefore we're following Rav Papa, even though we normally would not paskin like Shmuel. That's the way the Rif wants to learn. That we're going to paskin like Rav, because when you see Rav Papa, the way he explains it sounds like he's holding like him. Of course, it's a discussion in the commentaries if this is a proof, if is Rav Papa really explaining Shmuel in a way that it looks like he holds like him, or is he just explaining the opinion? You have very often we explain other views that you don't hold like. So it's a little debate in the commentaries if this is a good enough reason to paskin like Shmuel, even though normally only monetary laws do we paskin like Shmuel. Do we follow Shmuel's view? Normally, halachic issues that are not monetary, we follow Rav. And here, the Rif wants to paskin like, interestingly enough, wants to paskin like Shmuel because of Rav Papa's involvement over here. And Rav Papa is explaining Shmuel. So, the Gemara now, the Gemara gave a reason why would Reb Meir hold that it's invalid, and why would Reb Yehuda hold it's valid between 3 handbreadths and 4 handbreadths of a board in Shmuel's, according to the way Shmuel understands this. What would the reason be? In this, we explain that it has to do with, on the one hand, it's not a domain. It's not something choshev, something significant, because it's less than 4 handbreadths. So it's not a very wide board that would be considered like a domain, like regarding the laws of Shabbos, Rishus HaYochid. There's a certain measurement for Rishus HaYochid. It would need to be so that size is like a domain. We've seen that concept before, also in our tractate, that 4 handbreadths is a domain. We saw that regarding the laws of Tumah. We saw that regarding the laws of a sukkah, under a sukkah. How big does the top sukkah have to be? If you remember, we were talking about a domain being 4 handbreadths. That might be enough to be considered a sukkah that's under a sukkah. I'm just trying to remind you of some of the laws that we learned regarding this type of concept, that 4 tefachim, 4 handbreadths, is a domain. Here also, Rav Meir is going to say, here also everyone is going to hold, according to Shmuel, that more than 4 handbreadths is a domain. It's considered significant, that will make a gzeira, that it's similar, will make a decree that this is very similar to a roof. What about if it's less than 4 handbreadths? So Reb Yehuda says, well, less than 4 handbreadths is not such a significant size. But Reb Meir is going to say, well, it's more than lavud. It falls out of the category of love. Lavud means is a small, insignificant amount that we consider attached. It's so small, less than 3 handbreadths. If it doesn't fit within that category of less than 3 handbreadths, according to Reb Meir, he says it's that you see it has some level of significance, and therefore we're going to consider it similar to a roof. We're going to say, well, this is a board. This is a significant board. We got to say it has similarity to a roof, and we're going to prohibit it. Gzeiras tikra. This is a decree of tikra. So according to Shmuel, everyone agrees that there is a gzeira, there is a decree of tikra. The only question is, where does the decree kick in? Does it start at 3 handbreadths, or does it start at 4 handbreadths? According to Reb Yehuda doesn't even agree that there's a gzeiras tikra, there's a decree of similar to a roof. According to Rav, there is no such decree in Reb Yehuda's view. In Reb Meir's view, yeah, kicks in at 4 handbreadths. That's the way Rav explains it. According to Shmuel, everyone agrees that there is a gzeiras tikra. Only where does it kick in? Does it kick in at 3 or at 4? Okay, and then the Gemara had 2 proofs against Rav. One proof was from our Mishnah, because our Mishnah talked about a case where you have a 4 handbreadth board, and the Mishnah had said that 4 handbreadth board is going to it's not going to ruin your sukkah, but you're not allowed to sit and sleep under it. So what that shows us is that 4 handbreadths is a problem. 4 handbreadths board is a problem. Now, according to Shmuel, that's correct. According to everyone, a 4 handbreadth board is a problem. The case of the Mishnah that it wouldn't ruin your sukkah, but you just can't sleep under it, must be talking about a case where it's on the side of the sukkah, so you have the law of Daifan Akuma, you could get around, but you can't sleep under it. According to Rav, how do you learn such a case? The Mishnah says that it's that you can't sleep under it, and according to Rav, Reb Yehuda holds that there's no gzeiras tikra. There's no decree. Why shouldn't you sleep under it? Sleep under it's wood. It comes from the ground. It's not mekabel tumah. Sleep under it. And the answer the Gemara gives is that Rav explains that case in the Mishnah that it's a continuation of Reb Meir. Reb Meir says, Oiser, Reb Meir prohibits Nesarim. And the Mishnah continues, and it follows Reb Meir's view that, and if you do have a case where you have one that's more than 4 handbreadths, it will not ruin the sukkah if it's on the side, but it will be a problem to sleep under it. So the Reb Meir's view is really the way Rav is explaining it. That statement in the Mishnah is following Reb Meir's view, and it's like a continuation almost of Reb Meir's previous statement. Now, the Gemara then brings another proof against Rav. And the other proof, it's a little more complicated case. It had to do with, it compared having 2 sadinim, which we translate as sheets or some type of cloth. The simple meaning of a sadin is a sheet, I guess. So it's two sheets that you're using for schach. And of course, sheets are not kosher for schach. So shnei sadinim, they're makabel tuma. You can't use them for it won't be valid for schach. And if you did use them, they will join together to prohibit your sukkah. Okay, so they're going to join together and make your sukkah invalid. Where is this case in the Gemara? The Gemara's case is Tashmat, the bottom line actually is 14a. So this case takes us on to the next side. So when you have these two sadinim, mitzdarfin, shnein, they are mitzdarf. The two boards are not mitzdarf. So this is a brisa. The brisa compares these two sheets to these two boards. And what does it say? So it brings two opinions. The first opinion is that the two sheets, mitzdarfin, they do join together to prohibit your sukkah. The two boards do not join together. They are ein mitzdarfin. They don't join together, and they don't ruin your sukkah. Reb Meir says that the two boards are just like the two sheets. So let's think about this case. In Shmuel, the way Shmuel learned this, so the argument between Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda, the way Shmuel learns it, is in a case between 3 and 4 handbreadths. That would be the case of the argument. But if it has 4 handbreadths wide in the board, then for sure it is puzzle. Did you want to ask something, Mordechai? Oh. So if it has 4 handbreadths, according to Shmuel, everyone agrees that it's invalid. So what would the case be talking about here? The case will say is talking about that it doesn't have 4 handbreadths, but it does have 3 handbreadths. And so what will be the halacha over here, the way Shmuel is learning this brisa? How is Shmuel going to learn the brisa? So you have these two sheets. They don't have 4 handbreadths, but they do have 3. Or you have 2 boards. They don't have 4 handbreadths, but they have 3. So it's probably a similar, we're making a contrast, so probably a similar case, both of them, the boards and the sheets. So let's say it's talking about that it has 3 handbreadths. Now, Reb Yehuda holds that they would be kosher for schach. What do I mean? When you have between 3 and 4 handbreadths, Reb Yehuda and Reb Meir argue in that case. So if Reb Meir holds that it's puzzle, so he'll have to deal with the fact that it joins together when you have 2 halves. You know, in other words, this is not kosher schach, 3 handbreadths. Now, the problem is, and I mentioned this yesterday, when you have a 3 handbreadth invalid schach, that's not the measure of invalid schach in general to ruin a sukkah or to not be able to sleep under it, because a 3 handbreadth invalid schach is really less than the official rule of invalid schach. Invalid schach, the rule is 4 handbreadths. However, we're dealing with 2 issues here. One is this item invalid schach? The next issue is how much invalid schach is on your sukkah. So is this an item that's invalid schach? According to Reb Meir, it's an item that's invalid schach because it's 3 handbreadths. On the other hand, it's not the size of invalid schach that ruins the sukkah. You need 4 handbreadths to ruin a sukkah. But it is invalid schach according to Reb Meir. According to Reb Yehuda, it's not even invalid schach because it's less than 4 handbreadths. This itself is not even called an invalid schach. Now, how do you how do you explain that on a simple terms? The simple way of explaining it is, in order for it's kosher schach, but rabbinically it's invalid schach if it's 3 handbreadths. So if you emphasize that there's a rabbinic issue here and there's a biblical issue. The rabbinic issue is that that any board that's 3 handbreadths wide, according to Reb Meir, is invalid schach. Now, invalid schach at 3 handbreadths wide doesn't necessarily ruin your sukkah. But if it joins together with another thing that's also invalid schach, then it will invalid your sukkah if it altogether reaches the size of 4 handbreadths. But this is invalid schach rabbinically because it's 3 handbreadths, and we'll see if it can join together with something else and ruin your sukkah. That we'll have to see. So the way Shmuel is going to explain the brisa is that you have these 2 boards, and the 2 boards are 3 handbreadths wide, and each of them on their own are invalid. But when they join together, what happens? It ruins the sukkah. So that's the way Reb Meir is going to explain. That's the way Reb Meir would hold that af the sarim kesadinim, they join together to ruin the sukkah at 4 handbreadths. The same thing would apply to the 2 sheets. The 2 sheets themselves are invalid schach, but they don't actually ruin the sukkah until they reach the size of 4. The size of 4, that's when they will ruin the sukkah. Or you can't sleep under it for sure. At least they definitely ruin that part of the sukkah. And the same thing applies to boards according to Reb Meir. They're invalid schach. They don't ruin the sukkah yet until they reach the size of 4. So you need to be mitztaref. You need to join them together. What would Reb Yehuda hold in Shmuel's opinion? Reb Yehuda says that there's nothing wrong with these. They're not invalid schach in the first place because the rabbis never made a decree about between 3 and 4 handbreadths. So if there's no decree about between 3 and 4 handbreadths, so of course the 2 boards are going to be very different than the 2 sheets. The 2 sheets, yeah, they're mitztaref. They join together to ruin your sukkah, or to not be able to sleep under it. The 2 boards, ein mitztarfin, they are not mitztaref. They don't join together. Why? Because it's kosher schach. It's boards that are less than 4 handbreadths. Okay, so that's the way Shmuel will explain it. Now, what about Rav? So now we got to do Rav. In Rav, the way Rav will explain, again, we're just working out the brisa to fit. And the Gemara is using this to say, doesn't seem like Rav can even fit with this. That's the Gemara's on this. The Gemara is saying, I don't think Rav can fit with this brisa. Of course, we'll soon find the answer. So how is Rav going to learn this brisa? So the way Rav understands it, and again, got to remember Rav. Rav holds out the whole argument between Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda is when it's more than 4 handbreadths. When it's less than 4 handbreadths, everyone agrees it's kosher. There's no problems. But if it's more than 4 handbreadths, that's when there's an argument. So in Rav, Rav explains that if it has 4 handbreadths, then there's a machlokes if it's kosher. If it doesn't have 4 handbreadths, everyone agrees it's kosher. So what is the case talking about? So let's work it out. So if we're going to be talking about that it has 4 handbreadths, so you have these 2 boards, they have 4 handbreadths. What would Reb Meir hold? Would it make sense what he says? Reb Meir says that they join together. They're like the sheets. They join together. That doesn't make sense in Reb Meir to even say that. What do you need them to join together for? They're 4 handbreadths. They're invalid. They ruin the sukkah. They at least ruin that you can't sleep under it. So why would what would the purpose of joining mitztaref? What's the meaning of the word mitztaref? They join together. It's invalid. It doesn't need to join any. Ella, rather, what must you say? That it's less than 4 handbreadths. Less than 4 handbreadths is kosher according to everyone. So the Gemara says, how do you explain this brisa? The Gemara answers that the way to explain the brisa is that we're dealing with 4. They do have 4 handbreadths, but we're not talking about ruining the sukkah because of you have schach puzzle in the middle of the sukkah. We're talking about ruining the sukkah because you have on the side of the sukkah you have more than 4 handbreadths, and because you have more than 4 handbreadths, That is why it could, because you have more than 4 handbreadths, according to Reb Meir, it itself is called schach puzzle. It's called invalid schach, but it's not going to ruin the sukkah until it has 4 cubits. So do you need it to join together with other 4 handbreadth schach in order to ruin the sukkah with 4 cubits? Yes, you would need it to join together if it's going to ruin the, in other words, there would be a concept of joining together these boards because it's not going to ruin your sukkah, because we have the law of doifen akuma that allows you to have on the side of the sukkah invalid schach up to a measurement. So if this joins together, then there's a concept of joining together mitzdarif. So in other words, the Gemara's problem initially was, what are you joining together? If we're dealing with 4 handbreadth boards, there's nothing to join together. The Gemara answers, yes, there is something to join together, because if they're joining together to reach the threshold of 4 cubits, which ruins the sukkah, then there is a concept of joining together. And that's the way the Gemara explains this brisa. Okay, now the Gemara says, and this is the new Gemara that we're going to start now, it's Lishna Achrina, another way of that the discussion took place between of explaining the brisa, or asking the question on the brisa, from the brisa on Rav. In other words, the Gemara earlier had one version of how this discussion played itself out. And now the Gemara is going to give us a different version, Lishna Achrina, another version of how this discussion played itself out. And probably they're both correct. In one base medrash, they probably had a discussion and they mentioned it the first way. And there was a different base medrash. Maybe one was in Neherda and one was in Surah. You know, there were different cities that they had these big yeshivas. So in one yeshiva, they discussed it. This is how it developed. This was the dialogue. In the other yeshiva, the dialogue went a little differently. And we'll see how they actually learned it differently. In other words, they came out, they were bothered with it in a more, the Lishna Achrina seems that it bothered them more. The terminology didn't flow, and therefore they had to explain it a little differently, because they were more bothered with the terminology. And let's learn this Lishna Achrina. Lishna Achrina, another version of this dialogue, and this trying to figure out Rav's way, if he could fit with this brisa. So Lishna Achrina is Bishleima l'Shmuel. It's good according to Shmuel. The brisa can work. You can work out the brisa according to Shmuel. Let me tell you where we are actually. Lishna Achrina is maybe about 10 lines, maybe 12 lines from the top of the page. It's page 14b. Lishna Achrina. It's this additional version, a new version of this dialogue. So Bishleima l'Shmuel, it's good according to Shmuel, the Amar that says, B'she'ein bahen arba'a machlokes. The argument is when it's less than 4 is where there's an argument. Between 3 and 4 is where there's an argument. If it's kosher for schach or not, when you have a board that's between 3 handbreadths and 4 handbreadths, there's an argument if that's kosher. That's the way Shmuel explained it. Then, and if it's good with this brisa. Why? So we'll soon see. The argument is when there's less than 4. Aval yesh behen arba. But if there is a board, if the board has 4 handbreadths, divrei hakoil psula, everyone agrees that it's invalid. So how will we explain the brisa? We'll explain the brisa that it's talking about in Shmuel, the way Shmuel is explaining it. Let's explain the brisa that we're dealing with boards that are 4 handbreadths, and Reb Meir talks about them joining together. Why does he need them to join together? Again, we're in Shmuel, and he's learning in an interesting way. We're learning that we're talking about boards that are 4 handbreadths. 4 handbreadth boards, everyone agrees that they're invalid. So what are we joining together? So Ramai Mitzdarfin, what does it mean Mitzdarfin? That Reb Meir holds they join together, and Reb Yehuda says they don't join together. What do you need them to join together for? They're invalid. So the answer is Mitzdarfin la'arba ames min atzad. That the way this version is understanding it is very similar to the way we explained it before in Rav, not in Shmuel, in Rav. In other words, we sort of used a not a simple translation, explanation of that case, we explained it to be in a different scenario than you would have guessed. This is the way the new version wants to explain even in Shmuel. This is the way it's explaining it, that we're really dealing with a sukkah that only has this board on the side, or a few of these boards on the side, not in the middle. And that's the way we're explaining that case. Again, the brisa was a little vague. It said 2 sheets are joined together, 2 boards don't join together. That's all it said. It didn't say where it is. So the way that this version of the Gemara wants to explain it is that we're dealing with these boards are on the side of the sukkah. And Shmuel is going to say, you know what? Reb Meir is going to hold that these boards. What's Reb Meir going to hold? He's going to hold that these boards join together to ruin the sukkah because they are reaching the threshold of 4 amos, 4 cubits. So each one of these boards is 4 handbreadths. Together, they reach 4 cubits, and we'll say that they're mitzdarif. They join together to reach 4 cubits, and that's what Reb Meir says. Now, Reb Yehuda would say that even though these are invalid schach because of a rabbinic decree, but they're not going to ruin, they're not going to join together. Very interesting. This is a complicated way of, it's a complicated Gemara. The commentaries struggle with this a little, but because this is not intrinsically invalid schach, Rabbi Yehuda is going to hold that it's not a problem, even though they're 4 handbreadths. And everyone agrees there's a gzeira here. But Rabbi Yehuda is going to say that, no, we don't join them together when it comes to the side of the sukkah. We're not going to say that they join together to ruin your sukkah. They're on the side of the sukkah. We have a rule of Doifet Akuma. You went, it is going to, you are going to complete the four cubits, which means that it is going to be a 4. The amount is going to reach 4 cubits, but nevertheless, we're going to say that it actually is not going to ruin your sukkah because these are not intrinsically invalid schach. They are really kosher schach. They're just rabbinically a problem. The Rabbi Yehuda is going to say that we don't join them together. If you had maybe one big, maybe if you had one big board, no, even not. If you had invalid schach, something was invalid. If you had, sheets, or if you have metal, things like that, that would join together to make it invalid. But here we're dealing with wood, and the way I must tell you, it's a complicated way of explaining this, but this is the way the understanding. At least some of the commentaries want to explain. Other commentaries are not comfortable with this explanation, and they come up with 2 other ways of how to explain it. But let's just finish up this way. Maybe we'll see the other explanation soon. So Shmuel is going to learn it this way, that there's an argument between Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda if you join these on the side of the sukkah, if they can join together or not to ruin the sukkah because of the fact that it's beyond 4 cubits. You're reaching the threshold of 4 cubits, and you're joining them. According to Reb Meir, they join together. These 4 handbreadth boards will join together to reach the threshold of 4 cubits, and it will be a problem of ruining your sukkah. Ella la Rav. But what about Rav? How is Rav going to? Bishleim la Reb Meir. We can fit this with Reb Meir, because Reb Meir is going to say that according to Reb Meir, he says the sukkah is invalid when you have 4 handbreadths. So my mitzdarfin. So what does it mean mitzdarfin, that they join together? Mitzdarfin la'arba amos minatzad. According to Reb Meir, they are mitzdarif, they can join together from the side and reach a threshold of 4 cubits, and it'll invalidate your sukkah. That's the way Reb Meir is going to look. But how is Reb Yehuda going to look? Reb Yehuda, the Amar, that Reb Yehuda that says afilo yesh behen arba kshera, Reb Yehuda that says even if it has 4, it's kosher. There's no decree of tikra that it's similar to a house, to a roof. My ein mitzdarfin. What does it mean that it doesn't join together? What does that mean? It doesn't join together. There's nothing to join together. These are kosher. Konim bialmaninu. These are kosher schach. These are reeds, regular reeds. Four hand breaths? Yeah, 4 hand breaths. What's wrong with that? They come from the ground. It's kosher schach. So what is it even saying? The words of ein mitzdarfin or mitzdarfin, ein mitzdarfin, shnei nasarim or ein mitzdarfin. How could it say ein mitzdarfin? What does that mean? They're kosher. What are you joining together? So the point of this this different version is right here, actually, that this version is not satisfied with the previous version because it uses the word in Reb Yehuda, ein mitzdarfin, they don't join together. Now, if you wanted to be more precise, you would use the words, these are kosher. There's nothing to join together, according to Reb Yehuda. So the previous Gemara was very satisfied. They don't join together because it's kosher schach. Kosher schach, there's nothing to join together for it to ruin it from the side. That's the previous way version. But our Gemara is saying, what do you mean? It says they don't join together. When you use those words, they don't join together. It sounds like there's something that could join and they don't. Here, there's nothing to talk about joining together. They're kosher schach. What are you joining together to ruin the sukkah? How do you join kosher schach together to ruin a sukkah? How do you use the word ein mitzdarfin? Use the word that these are kosher, say. Don't say they don't join together to ruin your sukkah. We're talking about kosher schach. So the previous Gemara was satisfied. It says it doesn't join together to ruin your sukkah. Yeah, it's kosher. It's kosher schach. It doesn't join together. This Gemara is saying, no, using the words, it doesn't join together to ruin your sukkah. You can't use those words when you're dealing with kosher schach. So the Gemara answers a very simple answer. The Gemara's answer is, Idi de ka'amar Reb Meir mitzdarfin. Since Reb Meir uses the word about if it joins together, Amar Reb Yehuda ein mitzdarfin. So Reb Yehuda uses the similar terminology that Reb Meir used, which is that he says ein mitzdarfin. In other words, that you're right. The word is not so precise, but since we have 2 opinions here, and Reb Meir, this is the word that you use. So Reb Yehuda also uses a similar word just to say that, and I hold it doesn't join together. But really, the right wording would be maybe more precise, would be if he said that this is kosher schach and there's nothing to talk about. That would be more precise. But the style of a brisa or of a mishnah often is that if this one says doesn't join together, or it does join together, the other one will say it doesn't join together. And really, it's saying that it's kosher in the first place, but it uses that type of terminology. So that's the answer of the Gemara, that the word ein mitzdarfin, you're right. It maybe doesn't imply the most clear opinion of that we want to show. It doesn't imply it so clearly, but it doesn't. It's not a problem, the Gemara says, because it's basically saying that it's kosher, and it uses that terminology because Reb Meir used that terminology. The other way of learning this Gemara, again, this second view version of the second version of the dialogue between how this brisa fits with Rav.
How we doing?
Just mute everyone here. Just 1 second. Mute all. Okay. So another way of explaining it is that we're dealing with the schach that we're dealing with is 4 handbreadths, and they're joining together with other 4 handbreadth boards. But when they reach the 4 amos threshold, when they reach this size of 4 cubits, what happens then? So then you stopped using at that point, part of the what happened at the threshold of 4 cubits is that there's part of this 4 handbreadth board that's within the 4 cubit threshold, and there's part of the same board that goes beyond the 4 cubit threshold. So at this point, what you have is you have a number of 4 handbreadth boards that all join together, and what they reach at the end of this 4 cubit threshold is that there's one more board that's overlapping. It's part of it is in the 4 cubit threshold, which normally should be kosher because of the rule of Doif and Akuma. And then it actually extends beyond that 4 cubit threshold, and it ruins the sukkah, right? It should ruin the sukkah seemingly because you've now gone beyond, you have invalid schach that has gone beyond the 4 cubit threshold. However, the thing is, how do we look at this final board that part of it is within the, part of it could be looked at as the wall of your sukkah, within the 4 cubit threshold. And the other part of it is extending outside of that 4 cubit threshold. So this is where Reb Yehuda has a little leeway to make his opinion. And he says that the final board is a half a handbreadth on the within the 4 cubit threshold, and 3.5 handbreadths that it extends outside of the 4 cubit threshold. And on the other side of the sukkah, you've got the same story. You've got 4 cubits that are filled up with these boards that are 4 handbreadth size. And then the final board is a half a cubit within the 4, is a half a handbreadth within the 4 cubit threshold. And then it extends 3.5 handbreadths outside of it. So what you end up having is a kosher sukkah in the middle, because you have 3.5 handbreadths and 3.5 handbreadths, a board that is less than 4 cubits, because we look at it as if it's less than 4 cubits, because the wall of the sukkah is called a doif and akuma. So Rabbi Yehuda is able to take advantage of that law of doif and akuma and say that your board is not a 4 handbreadth board, because part of it is within the 4 cubits of doif and akuma, and the other part of it is less than 4 handbreadths. So we're able to sort of like, we have a little leeway because of this law of doif and akuma. So this is one way. This is another way of maybe explaining in Shmuel. Again, what we're dealing with is, how does Rabbi Yehuda, allow a sukkah to be kosher when you have on the side of it boards that are more than 4 cubits? In Reb Meir, we have no problem. He says it's not kosher. But in Reb Yehuda, how do we accept this concept of ein mitzdarfin in Reb Yehuda, the way Shmuel is explaining it? In other words, the way the second version is explaining it, that we're dealing with, it's on the side of the sukkah. On the side of the sukkah, you've got boards that are 4 cubits, 4 handbreadth boards that add up to 4 cubits. Why is Reb Yehuda allowing it and saying it's ein mitzdarfin? This is what we're dealing with. So the first way the Gemara explained is, the first way we explained was that the fact that it's not intrinsically invalid schach allows you to say that they don't join together to ruin to ruin your sukkah. They're on the side of the sukkah. They're not going to ruin your sukkah. It's not a problem. It's not a problem. It goes beyond 4 cubits, but it's not a problem because it's not intrinsically invalid schach. Commentaries don't like that pshat, even though the Maharam says it. And they come up with this way of explaining the Maharam, that maybe this is the meaning of this. Maybe this is the meaning of the Maharam. In other words, this second explanation that I'm sharing with you, it allows you, it could fit within that first explanation that it's not just that because it's not intrinsically invalid schach, but it's that the final board we're able to cut in half. We're able to consider part of it goes within the law of Daifan Akuma, and it's part of a wall, and the other half is less than 4 handbreadths, which Rabbi Yehuda allows. So the case of Ein Mitzdarfin means that we don't join the part that goes beyond the 4 cubits as if it's connected to the other parts, and it invalidates your sukkah. So that's another way of learning. The final way of learning is the Maharshah's way, and the Maharshah's way of learning is that the way Shmuel explains it is that Rabbi Yehuda says it's not mitzdarif, it doesn't join together. He's talking about boards that don't have 4 handbreadths. And when the Gemara uses the term, the Gemara says, my mitzdarfin, what it really means is that why is Rabbi Yehuda using a term mitzdarfin? If they're less than 4, it should be kosher in the first place. According to Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yehuda says that these boards are kosher. And the Gemara says, my mitzdarfin le'arba amais min atzad, what it means is that if it would be 4 handbreadths, it would be considered a problem of joining together, and therefore, even if it's less than 4 handbreadths, we use the same term. The Gemara basically, the point is that the way the Maharsha is learning is that the logic is no problem. Logically, everything fits because he says the case is talking about it's less than 4. We're talking about a case that it's less than 4. It's between 3 and 4 handbreadths each board. The problem with this pshat is that why does it use the word mitzdarfim? They're joining that according to Rabbi Yehuda, they don't join together. What do you mean they don't join together? They're kosher. So the answer to that is that in Rabbi Yehuda's view, if they would be more than 4, they wouldn't be kosher. And because of that, we can use the word mitzdarfim, because if they would be more than 4, that's what the Gemara is saying. My mitzdarfim, what does he mean to use the terminology of mitzdarfim? Mitzdarfim for arba amais min atzad, if it would have 4. Because according to him, there is a concept of mitzdarfim. So therefore, we can use that word in a loosely translated in his opinion, even though according to him, it's kosher in the first place. The problem was, how does Rav learn? Because Rav, there is no such concept of mitzdarfin. Everything is kosher. In Rabbi Yehuda, you could, in Shmuel, we could explain it, because Rabbi Yehuda holds that 4 would be an issue of tziruf, would be a concept of tziruf, would be a concept of combining, and we would combine it. So therefore, even less than 4, we use such terminology, ein mitzdarfin. But according to Rav, the Gemara said, Rav doesn't hold of any concept of tziruf. Why does it use the word tziruf? And on that, the Gemara answers that, well, Reb Meir uses the word tziruf. So therefore, Reb Yehuda also can use the word tziruf. So now I've explained you the Gemara 3 ways of explaining this. Again, it's a little complicated how to go about it. And we really, if you wanted to do it right, we really should try to think about and try to figure out how does this really work, that on the first two explanations. The third explanation that I shared with you is the Maharshah's explanation. According to him, logically, everything fits very well. It's just the wording of the Gemara and the wording of the Bryce is what's a little forced, a little forced way of fitting it in. But according to the first two explanations, we're coming up with two innovations, really. There's two major innovations that they're coming up with, in the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Number one, the first way we explained it, you're coming up with this great innovation that according to, if you have such boards that are 4 handbreadths from the on the side of your sukkah, and they reach a threshold of 4 cubits, it's going to be kosher according to Rabbi Yehuda. That's quite an innovation. And then according to the other opinion, maybe it's less of innovation, but the concept of that if you have one board that's at the end of the 4 cubit threshold, and that board is partially in, partially out, we actually, according to Rabbi Yehuda, we divide that board in half and say it's not 4 handbreadths. What do you mean? It physically is 4 handbreadths. But according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, we're able to say, no, we look at it as if part of it is part of the wall, and part of it is considered your sukkah. And because we're dividing it in half, in halakhically, we're able to say that it's not a 4 handbreadth board, even though physically it is 4 handbreadths. But we're able to say that's quite an innovation as well, to say that we look at it as if it's not 4 handbreadths, and we say that this is a kosher sukkah because part of it is the wall and part of it is your kosher sukkah. So again, it's a complicated Gemara. It's something to think about. If you review this would be something to think about. But now at least you have the 3 ways of understanding it. And now the Gemara says that there's a brisa that fits with Rav and a brisa that's going to fit with Shmuel. So we have now, we're going to see some, this is a little easier. Let's continue in the Gemara now. Tanya Kavosei de Rav. We are maybe about 25 lines, maybe 23 lines, 22 lines from the top of the page. Tanya Kavosei de Rav, and Tanya Kavosei de Shmuel. We have a brisa that'll show us Rav's view. That means that there's a Tana that seemed to learn the way Rav is learning. We have a brisa that seems to fit. But Tanya Kavosei de Shmuel, we have a brisa that seems to fit with the way Shmuel learned it. How does that work? What that means is that the Amoraim didn't always know every brisa, and as long as they don't contradict the brisa, it's no problem. They knew every Mishnah. You know, if they were an Amoira, later rabbi, they had to know all the Mishnahs. They didn't necessarily know all the brisas, all these statements that were said. But as long as they don't contradict it, it's no problem. So here we have a brisa that fits with Rav, and we have a brisa that fits with Shmuel. Obviously, Rav's way of thinking followed the way this Tana learned. Now, what's the brisa? Tanya Kavosei de Rav. We have a brisa like that follows the way Rav that we explained in Rav. Sikcha ben asarim shel erez. If you used cedar boards, Shein ben arba, it doesn't have 4 handbreadths. Divrei hakoil and kashera. Everyone agrees it's kosher. That fits with Rav. If it doesn't have 4, everyone agrees it's kosher. Shmuel held that that's an argument. If it's between 3 and 4 handbreadths, it's an argument between Rameir and Rabbi Yehuda. Rav says, no one argues. If it's less than 4, yeah, of course it's kosher, according to everyone. So that's this brisa. Yesh ben arba, if it has 4, that's where there's an argument. Rameir paisa, Rabbi Yehuda machshir. Rameir says it's invalid. Rabbi Yehuda says it's kosher. And Amar Rabbi Yehuda, now the brisa continues and tells us, Rabbi Yehuda says, I want to prove my point. You prove my view. And Rabbi Yehuda says, there was a story in the time of a gzeira. In other words, there was a decree from the government that we weren't allowed to do mitzvahs. It was a time of sakana, of danger. What it basically means is that the evil government prohibited them from building sukkahs and having sukkahs. So what did we do in that time when there was a decree? We brought boards that had 4 handbreadths. And we put these on top of our porch. And or maybe like a balcony. We put it on top of our balcony. And and we sat under this schach. What was the schach? It had 4 handbreadths, and we used it. We sat under it. Now, how did that work? How was that allowed? Because basically, what they did was, Rabbi Yehuda is saying, we built our sukkah similar to a house. It looked like a house. It had boards, and yet it was kosher. And we did that in the time of sakana. And so you see that 4 handbreadths, there is no gezerah. There's no problem, because normally we don't have such maybe large boards, or we don't normally use such large boards. But time of gezerah, that we specifically use those boards. Obviously, it's a kosher sukkah. So there's no such thing as a gezerah stikra. There's no such thing as a decree. So Amrullah, so the rabbis, which is basically Reb Meir and I guess his friends, that they said back to Reb Yehuda, oh, you're trying to prove your point. Misham Raya, you bring a proof. Ain't Shas HaSakana Raya. There's no proof from a Shas HaSakana. There's no proof. Shas HaSakana, you have to understand, this is a rabbinic decree, Gzeras Tikva. This is a rabbinic decree. You have no other choice. What should you do? Use the non-kosher schach that's rabbinically non-kosher, because biblically it is kosher. So you want to bring a proof from there? That's not a proof. So this is like a very interesting Gemara, because what it shows us is that when there is a problem of a rabbinic decree that something is invalid, what happens in a case where you have no other choice whatsoever? Should you consider a rabbinic invalidity to be a rabbinic invalidation to be that it's invalid? It's not worth anything if we do it. Or do we say, no, biblically there's validity to this action, and rabbinically there's a problem, but at least we'll fulfill the biblical obligation? Or you could even take it a step further and say, and maybe the rabbis didn't put their rule in a case of sakana, in a case of danger from the government, where the government prohibited, maybe the rabbis didn't uphold their rule. But what do we also see? We also see Rabbi Yehuda thinks he has a proof from here. Why does Rabbi Yehuda have a proof from here? Because he holds that if this would not be valid rabbinically, we shouldn't even do it in the time of sakana. So we have from Rabbi Yehuda, we have one way of looking at it. From the rabbis, we have another way of looking at it. Rabbi Yehuda would hold, no, the rabbinic decree says you don't use it at all. It's invalid. It's invalid. Don't even try. Don't even try using it. But we have the rabbis arguing with him. No, Ein Shas HaSakana Raya. You don't have a proof from Shas HaSakana, which would basically mean that at the time of sakana, the rabbis don't uphold their rules, and this would be acceptable. This would be allowed. Or even if the rabbis do uphold their rules, you could say that we still should fulfill it on a biblical level. At least biblically, we fulfilled our obligation. So this would be, this is a very powerful source to extend to different places. We had a similar case a little earlier on where we talked about what happens if you have no other sukkah to use. Can you use a rabbinically invalid sukkah in such a scenario? Is there a case of b'diavad if you have no other choice? Where the rabbis had prohibited something, but what happens if you don't have any other sukkah and there's no other sukkah in your area? Would you be allowed to use such a sukkah? So this,
Rebbe, if you're there and there's no other sukkah to be used,
yeah.
So the question is, should you go in?
Is it not worth anything? Right? Should you go in, or is it not? Is it worthless?
That's a question of later. Later you can ask or find out, or whether you should feel bad about it.
No, let's say you're a big Rav. So you're the Rav. Is there a reason to go into the sukkah or is it not? Not. I'm talking about a person who doesn't know. I'm talking about a rabbi who knows. The question is, what is the halacha in this scenario? What do you paskin? Do you paskin that this is like Rabbi Yehuda? Seems like he holds that if this would really be not, if there would really be a rabbinic decree on tikra,
it would not.
There's no need to walk into a sukkah because you're gaining nothing. You know what I mean? It's almost like you have non-kosher tefillin. Should you put on the non-kosher tefillin if you have no other choice? It's not worth anything, right? That's the way Rabbi Yehuda sees a gzeira d'Rabbanan. It's not worth it. It's worthless. You put up a non-kosher mezuzah. I have no other choice. I have a printed mezuzah that was a copy. It's a copy from a kosher mezuzah. Should I put it up? Rabbi Yehuda says that's what's going into such a sukkah. You're putting up a non-kosher mezuzah. You have some benefit by putting up such a mezuzah. It's worthless.
Understood.
Paper. The way you're wasting paper, wasting 10 cents on making copies.
Yeah, but
anyway, so that's
Rabbi, they're not. Those are not biblically. In other words, they don't have any biblical basis. Whereas, in other words, a paper mezuzah doesn't have any biblical.
Right? Or not rabbinic, not biblical. Correct.
Whereas with a rabbinic zera, it means that maybe the rabbi said when they made the decree, but if there was such a time of sakana, then our decree doesn't apply. That's different.
That's one way. That's if you look at it that way. But there is the other way of looking at it, where the rabbis made their rule to be absolute, and they basically said that we are obligating you to use kosher schach that's not this type of schach. This type of schach is invalid, and we are making it considered invalid even on the biblical level. In other words, that it really is not. That's the way Rabbi Yehuda seems to understand it. That this is, if there would be a rabbinic decree, it would be invalid even on a biblical level. That the rabbis have considered it not kosher. How do the rabbis have the power to do that? Probably something like a hefker bezdin hefker. We consider this schach not yours. It's not. It's not a kosher schach. They have avenues where they could use to utilize. So that's the way Rabbi Yehuda. Now the Ritva goes through the different ways of looking at this. So anyway, whatever. We'll have to maybe talk a little more about it on Sunday. Have a wonderful Shabbos, everyone. Zay Gazon.
Shalom. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
There's only one problem with this whole share. Sukkos is not following. If we had Sukkos right after the share, it would make sense. But now, it's like I'm eager to do something with it. Thank you.
You can build your sukkah according to Beis
Start early. Start building.
I got it out there. I just gotta lift up the schach and put it down.
Actually, even going to everyone. If you have kavanah for sukkah, l'shem sukkah, you can build it now.
Yeah, but then you have to lift it in 2 months.
It's not that far away, right? Anyway, Zay Gazon, have a good Shabbos.
Thank you.